Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Storytelling with People Data, Persuading Leaders and Standing Your Ground. We're going to give people another minute or so to log in before we fully kick off. So while you're waiting, it would be really cool to see where everyone who is here today is coming from. So if you could drop where you're dialing in from into the chat, we can see the spread of attendees.
Really looking forward to seeing where everybody is from. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And we see places already come in across the US, of course, many different places in the US. Oh, Europe, we see some places in Europe as well.
Yeah, it's always amazing how broad the audience to these conversations really are.
Ken, where are you calling in from?
I'm in Kingston, New York, just about 2 hours north of the city.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'm calling in from Palo Alto, California. And so I'm excited to join you all from the other side of the country, I guess. Again,
Yeah.
it's great.
Um, so we have a lot of people who've logged in. Feels like a good moment to kick us off officially. So again, thank you everyone for joining our webinar on storytelling and getting your leaders to really understand what you're talking about and persuading them to take meaningful action on the information that you're presenting. I'm Ken Matos. I am the Director of Market Insights over at HiBob. I focus on issues of thought leadership on where the HR world is going, with a focus on better operations, culture, and strategy for businesses. And I am so fortunate to be joined today by Kathi. If you would like to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kathi Enderes. I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Global Industry Analyst at the Josh Bersin Company. If you don't know us, we are a research and advisory company for the HR profession. So we are working with both corporate HR teams as well as technology firms to kind of help them move into the future and understand how to make work better. So that's what we're here for. And this topic is actually so near and dear to my heart. I have a PhD in mathematics, believe it or not. So that like the data piece and the analytics piece has always been part of what I wanted to go into. And I feel it's a great moment in time where the HR profession can actually be more data informed, because now data is actually easy to get, but how do you make them all of these insights into something that the business can take action on? So that's why I'm excited to talk here.
Excellent. So before we get started, we have a quick poll that will launch to our audience. Great. Now that that's up, I can move us to the meat of our conversation today. So, Kathi, you've spent a lot of time talking to businesses, looking at lots of data, takes many different forms. When you have a pile of spreadsheets, some analytic output, or other forms of raw data, how do you get started converting that into something persuasive, a narrative that's going to get someone to do something?
Yeah, I always think about starting with not the data actually, but starting with the problem. So in other words, what are you trying to solve for? What is something that the business should actually care about? What is something that somebody needs to take action on? So not thinking about just the data side, but what is something that maybe a hypothesis that you're trying to prove. So if you look at, for example, your employee engagement data, there's lots of data that you usually have, and many of you have engagement a surveys, for example. It's maybe interesting to see what engagement is like, but maybe it's more interesting to see where there's maybe where the trends are, or how engagement compares to other companies that are in your industry, or is there certain groups where engagement is lower than on others? So thinking about, is there a problem that you're trying to solve? Is there some insight that you're trying to create, or is some even more importantly, is there some action that you're trying to drive? So I see this journey to go from data to analytics, like interpreting the data, seeing trends and all of that, to getting actual insights and findings, to driving action. And that kind of storytelling with data is really the point of that, is to drive the right action. All the other things are maybe less important, because otherwise it's just an interesting thought exercise.
Yeah, I was just joking with someone about how being told that your presentation was interesting is actually the worst form of praise to get because it means they don't know what to do with it. And
Yeah.
I love your example of engagement, 'cause so often people go in and they present engagement, and the reason they are presenting it is because it really hits something that they care about, but not something that their audience is motivated around. So it's like, are we here to improve retention? Are we here to improve performance and motivation? Like, why are we having a conversation about engagement in the first place? And so your point
Yeah.
of like what is it you're trying to do really resonates with how often those conversations can go wrong because nobody set that foundation at the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, I'll tell you a story about the engagement and the retention side of things. I used to be before I did this, and I was what I'm doing now. I was leading talent and workforce and organizational effectiveness at Kaiser Permanente, a very large healthcare organization. And anytime we looked at engagement, of course, we had 200,000 employees, 100, like over 100,000 nurses, so like really big scope and all of that. And every time we looked at engagement, or if we looked at engagement in the context of retention, for example, it wasn't really all that interesting for us because we had such low turnover. We had 5% turnover, so nobody would ever leave. On the other hand, if you're on in a company that has very high turnover, for example, maybe you're in a retail company, or you're in a maybe in a manufacturing company, or like, I don't know, hospitality, any of these like high turnover things, retention actually translates directly in dollars, right?
Mhm.
Because if you can't retain people, or then you can't hire people fast enough, for example. So really thinking about what does it translate to, and why would we care about it, is very specific to the business that you're in as well. So
Absolutely.
that, yeah, business environment. So what's interesting for one company might not be interesting at all for another company.
Absolutely. And so just beginning with what is the problem we're trying to solve? What's the opportunity we're trying to capitalize? It gives purpose to all those numbers. I think it also really helps you cut back on the sheer number of things that you present because it's when you have a particular case you're trying to make, you can present just enough information to do that rather than like throw a whole pile of numbers at somebody and say, like, figure this out.
No, absolutely. It's so true. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about what we should present, for example, what should we present to an executive, always think about what's the story you want to tell, and not what are the numbers that you want to share. So don't think about the number, think about the story first, think about the insights first, think about what action you want to drive there, and then work backwards on what data you need to support that. So I think we sometimes make the mistake to think all the data is so interesting when you need to cram everything in there, but less is more, especially when you're dealing with executives, when you're thinking about what you want to present to executives, because they don't have a lot of time and they really want to get to the to the point of it very quickly. And if you overwhelm them with all these, oh, here's some benchmarks, and here's what we see other industries doing, and here's how we see some trends, but there's really no story in there, you're going to lose them very quickly, and they're going to move on.
Yeah. So on that point, thinking about your conversations with executives around HR metrics, what are some of the biggest disconnects that you've seen where HR people just lose the conversation, control of the conversation, and what can they do to get it back?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the biggest thing that we see both when we work with HR teams, and also what I've seen in my own practitioner experience and also in my consulting experience, is not speaking the language of the business. And what I mean by that is the language of the business Taking engagement, for example. Funny story, when I was leading this, like the whole people analytics and talent space at Kaiser Permanente, we had, of course, for the engagement survey, for example, always created these big decks, right? So we created a really big deck for all the executive team members, and we had this kind of this roadshow where we talked through it before we shared it with managers and all of that. And our team had put this together really well and was a really big deck and beautifully done. And so I go and meet with the president of one of the units there, one of the regions there, and I started into this this spiel on how our engagement numbers are looking and all of that, and how it compares. And it was actually all pretty good news story. And so I start into that, and after kind of a minute where I'm going into this presentation, he stops me and he says, "I don't care about this at all." And I'm like, "Well, why do you not care?" And he's like, "Well, engagement is not a thing that I care about." And of course, I wanted to go into this, well, why you should care about it, because employees that are more engaged have a better business performance, because that's kind of my background, what I know about it. But instead, I asked him, "Well, what do you care about?" And so he knew exactly what he cared about, right? So he said, "I care about patient safety. I care about patient satisfaction. I care about financial performance. I care about workplace safety." So he rattled off like a few of these indicators of performance that matter to him. And so we went back with our team and actually saw how what we saw in the employee survey correlated with those outcomes. And guess what? It was the same things that correlated with that. It was people being recognized, people having a voice, people having kind of a say in how they did their work, having the right resources. It was all the same things that actually drove engagement. But engagement was our HR metric. It wasn't the business's metric. And then we came back with this new presentation and said, "Here's where all of these things stand. Here's some teams that do this really well. Here's some teams that don't do all of this really well." And this now not being engagement, but this being patient satisfaction, patient safety, workplace safety, financial performance. And then he said, "Well, now I care about it. Now tell me how I can improve it and how I can help my teams that are not doing this well, what we need to do as a business to actually amplify that." So really understanding deeply, and we can ask people, right? We can ask people, "What do you care about? What are your measures of success?" There's no shame in that. And I think it makes us better HR business partners, better HR consultants, better people analytics people, whatever our role is, better CHROs, whatever our role is, really understanding more deeply on what the business cares about rather than using our own HR language.
So true. Well, a piece of language I learned from our sales team was the idea of doing good discovery and really going out and doing what you did and saying, what do you care about? Like, why are you showing up to this meeting and what are you hoping to walk away with? Let me
Yeah,
build my presentation around that. Let me go find the relationships between what I study and work on and what you study and work on, and thereby create like a win-win for us rather than here's what I want and I'm just asking you for stuff. And they're just like, this doesn't help me achieve my things. So why would I give you some of my precious resources? And so I think
exactly.
so often there's just an opportunity for HR to do that. I think so many of us love to just do a good job and execute what people have asked for, and stopping for a moment and be like, why are you asking me to do this? What is the purpose of all this work? Is really empowers you to make a better case for it.
It's so true. I mean, when I started my work in management consulting, so I worked 10 years in management consulting with the big consulting firms. And the first thing we learned about being consultants, being good consultants, is asking why 7 times. So basically, somebody asked you for some numbers and you said, "Well, why do you need this?" And not to, of course, put them on the spot, but somebody says, "How many managers do we have in our organization?" Well, that's a question you could just go out and basically pull the numbers, but then probably maybe you didn't answer the question behind the question. So ask them,
Mhm.
"Why would you need to know this?" Okay, and so they say, "Well, we want to see what our spans of control are." Like, okay, why would you want to know this? Okay, maybe we need to know if we have, if we're too high or too low, if we have too many people reporting to managers, or maybe we want to know if maybe we're basically we have too small of a span of control. Maybe we can consolidate. And so asking those kind of questions. Or maybe we need to know how many managers we have because we need to create a management development program. Very
Mhm.
different approaches, right? Very different data points that you want to bring them in addition to just giving them a number, understanding what they're trying to solve for, why they need to do this. Or maybe they just need to know it for reporting purpose because they need to report to some kind of some government body or whatever it is. Well, then maybe they just need a number, right? So you really
Yeah.
need to know what's the purpose behind that. So keep asking the why question. Why do you need to know this? What do you want to do with it in order to not bring them something? And then I said, well, didn't just need to know how many managers we have, but I also need to know how many people they manage on average, right? And whereas maybe there's some where there's more people than the average, where there's less people than the average, and how it compares to industry standards. So otherwise, you go back to the drawing board and don't give people basically the information they need.
Absolutely. I think there's something that you touched on just in passingly that it's good to call out is there's a little bit of politics around asking the question why. Often that's used to stop a project, when in reality you're trying to make sure the project achieves its goals. I was once working with a hospital where the stakeholder was determined to show that their managers were really poor at management because they wanted to do a management training and that was going to justify the work there. And I was like, the data doesn't support that. People love their managers at your organization. And they were upset. And I was like, why are we going into this? And like, well, because all the nurses keep transferring from some departments to other departments. And I just wanted to show that those managers were bad so I could help them. I was like, oh, if that's what you're looking for, then I can actually do something very different for you. And what we found was that the transfers were associated with the nature of the work when it was really rigid compliance, no voice, no engagement with patients in any emotionally satisfying way, they transferred out. And so it was
Yeah.
not, is my manager mean? It was really about, is my manager able to help me see the emotional value in this department's activities? And
Mm.
so they're like, oh, we can do something with that. But if I hadn't pushed on it and said like, I'm not trying to block you. I'm really engaged with this idea. Clearly, you're trying to accomplish something. Help me understand what that is so that I can help you. We never would have gotten there. And so I think our audience should
Yeah.
take some of these stories to illustrate like this is really what I'm trying to do when I ask you why, so that to help people not feel defensive.
Yeah, and it's such a great point because sometimes there's a little bit of courage that you need to have to ask the why question because especially sometimes in HR and if the role of HR is more kind of just doing what the business asks us to, we might be tempted to just say, "Oh, you asked for how good our managers are, and I'm just going to give you those data points." But if you don't ask the why question, you can't solve that problem, right? And you can't help them actually understand how to solve that problem. And sometimes it's something that's counterintuitive, and that should be okay too. So having that kind of both the maybe the courage to ask the why question, but then also ask it in a way that people don't feel, oh, you just want to get out of doing this work altogether, right? You just want to say, oh, well, why would you need this? I mean, it could be, well, I'm too busy, I just can't do the work.
Right.
Or it could be, oh, well, help me understand how you're going to use this data because so I can give you the right information. And then when they give you something else, then you can say, okay, what's behind that? So we can actually support you in solving the problem in a better way. So there's this kind of consulting skill or this conversational skill in addition to the courage that we need to have in order to get to the right data that we need to bring in order to inform the right action.
Absolutely. So you create I'm sure, a lot of stories for a lot of different people. What strategies have you found most effective for translating a complex HR metric into like a clear business outcome?
Yeah, so the first question is, of course, the first thing is, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the problem? What's the hypothesis that we might have, right? That we wanna get to. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, what data will you need? And usually it used to be maybe 10, 15 years ago or longer, it was very hard to get data. Well, today it's actually very easy to get data. We have more data than we need. So it's
Yes.
more about, it used to be, well, we can't get to the data. Now it's more like, what's the right data and what's the right data to connect it to? So like thinking about, in addition to the data that we have, what other data do we need to connect it to? In the case that I mentioned, for example, on the engagement survey, we didn't just need our own employee survey data. We needed outside data from outside of HR data, meaning outside of HR data, we needed financial performance data, we needed patient satisfaction data, which was not in our database, of course. So building those relationships and finding those kind of data points that we want to connect it to is the other thing, in order to see what are teams doing that are doing things well, for example, and what are the teams doing that are not doing things well. We do the same thing, by the way, in our studies. We do all of our maturity studies when we study kind of any kind of HR talent process, learning and development, recruiting, leadership development, overall HR effectiveness, HR practices, employee experience, whatever we study, basically, we always correlate things with business outcomes, not just with what we in HR are accountable. So thinking outside of that box, basically of the HR box, really, really important too. And then there's a few counterintuitive things that I always tell people about too. So first is avoid the accuracy trap. And what I mean by that is not being overly accurate. I always cringe when I see presentations or insights where there's like, oh, we have a 25.23% increase in this. And like immediately when people actually don't like what you're telling them, and always when you're telling somebody something, some story where they need to change something, somebody is not going to like the story, right? If you're telling, for example, managers to behave differently, if you're telling leaders to focus on other things for their employees, if you're thinking about any kind of change, somebody's not going to like it. And if you have this accuracy trap, immediately people will shoot holes into your data rather than accept the story. So they're going to ask questions like, well, how come this is 25.23? And tell me exactly what the end size was of these employees. Oh, we didn't have 527 employees at this moment in time. We actually had 529, which actually is completely irrelevant, of course, for the story you're trying to tell them, usually in insights, not in reporting, right? If you need to just do a reporting for like the compliance or something, you need absolute accuracy, right? You need accuracy. But if you're trying to tell a data story, tell them it's not 25.23%, but it's 1 in 4, example. It's the same story, right? But then people won't be able to shoot shoot holes into your store, into your data, but they'll be more open to, okay, well, 1 in 4, that's actually not a lot, right? So maybe it is a lot depending on what you're looking at. So they'll be more open to seeing the story rather than like kind of investigating the numbers. Another thing, another practice that I always do is bring actual stories, use case stories, not just data stories. So in other words, for example, if we see we actually just did a study last year on people analytics, and rather than just telling, one of the big insights was there to do what we call systemic business analytics, so connect on people analytics with business data and make this much more agile to connect that. And rather than just saying that, bring a story that resonates, that explains that. So bring stories, bring examples. In your internally, you can also bring stories. For example, in the engagement story that I said, like, don't just say, well, there are some teams that don't do patient satisfaction well, and those are the teams that do it really well. You could say in these kind of teams, for example, we saw that nurses in this case can't really speak up, and so they don't have a say in how they're doing their work. And what that means is that it could result in, for example, them not telling a physician to wash their hands before they are going into surgery, and that could result into negative patient outcomes. And then people really get it, right? Because then the people say, oh, that's why it matters if nurses can speak up. Because otherwise you might say, well, I don't really care if they can speak up. But if you're saying, well, they could see something, and if they don't feel empowered to actually see something to somebody who has is higher status or higher authority in their organization, something bad could happen for the patient. And then people really get it.
Yeah.
So
I
like the examples are really important.
So true. Like if you assume that your audience knows why the metric matters, you really set yourself up to have a fall. And I love your use of storytelling to convert this engagement number, this speaking up number into patient safety because the patient gets an infection if the doctor doesn't wash
Right.
their hands. And that's the number that you care about. And let me draw you the path back to the number that I'm caring about. And so I really like to sort of start with, hey, we want to do something. Here's what impact we think it's going to have on the business. This is what we
Yes.
did. This is the impact it had on the business. And so you can hook people with a clear value statement of like why you're telling them this story in the beginning, go very quickly through what you did, and then what I did ended up with what we were hoping to feel was changed. It's super simple, but it really makes it clear that like this is a story for you and not a story for me and other people who like the numbers that I play with.
Yeah, a very simple framework that I have and that we can think about is when I try tell them like the what is it that you're talking about, and you want to tell them the so what, like why does it matter, right? What's the impact?
Mhm.
And then you want to tell them the now what. So what should you do with it? And that's a very simple thing. Like these three questions really describe this quite well to say like what is it? Like this is about engagement, but it's really about more than engagement. So what? Well, this is not just about engagement for engagement's sake. This is actually for the patient safety. And here's the story around that. Now what? What do we want you to do with that? Well, now we want you to help us
Mhm.
inspire this culture where every nurse and every employee can speak up and create this, have a say in what they're doing. So it's very simple, but it moves you away from just looking at data and staring at that data and saying, oh, what am I going to do with this now? And I'm going to tell them all the correlation and all of that. I found that usually it depends on your audience too, how much you have to explain how you did it and your methodology. Some people, if you're working with engineers, for example, they want to know all the things, right? They want to, and we get this too when we do our studies and we present them. And there's people that are very analytical, like the people analytics people, for example, they want to do, okay, what kind of regressions did you do? And what were your outcome variables? And how did you define them? And how did you, like, what was the kind of the R squared or whatever it is, right? And then others might, and business leaders might just say, well, are you sure this is accurate? Are you sure this is true? And you're saying, yes, we tested it, we validated it,
Mhm.
it's sound, and then they're gonna accept it. So it kind of depends on your audience, of course, who you wanna, how deep you wanna go in your methodology and how you got to the answer here. One really good trick that I found in organizations, if you want to make sure that people accept your data story, is if you have anything that's related to finance, for example, you've got to work with the finance team in order for them to look at that too. So if you have some kind of business case or some kind of thing, basically, where you want to get financial numbers behind it, financial support behind it, work with the finance team because they're going to ask you, of course, they're going to ask you, well, has anybody in finance seen that? And if the finance team has worked with you side by side, it's a different story and they can then be your supporter, right? Or if you want the business to do something different, work with business managers, with operations on first identifying what the problem is and then analyzing the data and telling the story. If you're saying, well, we tested this with operations and they feel it's solving their problems and it's something that they can do. It's a different story than just saying, oh, we think operations has to do something about it, but we don't quite know what it is, and we don't quite know how it fits into their work processes. So getting somebody outside of HR involved early on, really important.
And the position of that person, I think, also is really important. As a funny, very early story in my career, when I did my dissertation, I got the most respected and hard to deal with stats professor to be on my committee because I knew when I got to my defense, if he had signed off on it, no one was going to ask me a stats question. Like the numbers were resolved. If he signs off on it, we're good. Let's talk about the thing you actually are here to talk about, Ken. And so I think sometimes you want to work with the person who makes it difficult up front so that everyone else just goes, I don't want to deal with the difficulty. If you got through them, then this must be good. Um, and
Yeah, it's so true. And sometimes we think in terms of change management, we want to just get our champions, but getting your blockers on board or getting their concerns out early on sometimes helps you a lot more. And a lot of this is change management, right? Because in the end of the day, why do you want to tell these data stories? Usually want something to change, something to happen. So thinking about who can help with this change management upfront, because otherwise you get this, what you just mentioned, Ken, before, oh, this was interesting, and nobody's going to do anything with it. So much
exactly.
better prepared. And usually the people that do the analysis oftentimes don't need to take action themselves, but they need to understand who is the person that we need to get action from. Is it maybe the training department because they need to train the new managers? Is it maybe recruiting needs to do something different because maybe we need to hire different people, or maybe it's operations because they need to manage things in different ways or schedule things in different ways. For example, all of those things, considering who needs to take action and getting them involved and on board early on, and even thinking through who are your supporters, who might be your blockers or your skeptics, and getting the skeptics on board early on matters too.
So I think we've made the transition to the second half of our conversation, where I think for the first chunk, we've been talking about how do you present a good story for someone who's open to listen. I presented you a good story. That was a great story. Great. I'll do something with that. I think we also have to recognize that in a lot of organizations, there are people who are just not eager to be changed and will be skeptical of what you're putting forward and might challenge. So let's talk a bit more about dealing with the challenging people when you present a data story. Um, what kinds of skepticism have you encountered around your HR data, and how have you addressed it in the moment?
Yeah, and we get skepticism all the time. We get skepticism, and I got skepticism as a practitioner, of course. And I mentioned some of these things when people actually, I think that behind that is if people don't like what you're telling them, they're trying to discredit your methodology, your data source, your hypothesis, anything that they can discredit. And we get this all the time when we have our insights that people say, well, not so much the receivers of our stories of our insights, but sometimes it's another group, maybe it's another consulting group, it's another team basically that says, well, we see something different, or we want to tell a different story. So I want to shoot holes into
Mhm.
your data, into your methodology. And as a practitioner, you get this, of course, a lot too. So people might say, well, I don't believe this. And it goes back to what I said. Some of the things go back to what I said before. Like if you're, for example, telling a story around very accurate numbers that might change like in small pieces, not
Mhm.
conceptually, not directionally, but in kind of the actual decimals very quickly, very easy for people to say, well, I don't believe any of this because the database is not exactly correct. Wait a minute. Like, I don't like, where did you get this from? And how did you get to that? And they're like, well, the data was not right. Or they're saying, well, the methodology wasn't right. We get this all the time in our data because
Mhm.
we do a lot of correlations. And of course, we get the correlation is not causation, which is true, of course.
Right.
And very hard to show causation with HR data. Very, very hard, of course, to show, for example, is there really a causal relationship between patient satisfaction and speaking up of patient safety, for example, and the ability for a nurse to speak up? Very hard to see causal relationship because
Mhm.
there's many other things, of course, that factor into that too. So that's where the stories, like the actual use case stories, always comes in there. So
Mhm.
these are proven, these are actual stories. It's not just a story you made up, but it's a story that actually happened. Um, much stronger, and that actually resonates, much stronger kind of social proof to say, oh yeah, somebody has already done this before and they got this outcome. So showing that causal relationship, even on just one use case, one specific story, will make it a much bigger story. Also, people don't really remember data all that much, right? People
Mhm.
remember actual stories. They
Yeah.
remember the story. They remember. You will probably not remember that only 9% of organizations are in this highest maturity of systemic business analytics. But how they do this, like the stories that I mentioned, how you connect business data with people data, how you think about using technology to empower and democratize storytelling with data, how you think about preparing the organization to take action. All of these kind of stories will resonate much more.
That's so true. I was working with a client once, and they were pinging me on benchmarks and just being like, "Can you get this benchmark more like us? Can you get it to be an organization in the same industry, founded at the same time, going through the same types of changes right now?" I'm like, "You're asking me for you in another timeline. Like
Yeah.
that's not possible." And for a moment, I was like, what am I going to do with this? They're totally skeptical of like the challenge I'm placing them against these very, very robust benchmarks. And then I stopped and I was like, I'm just going to be really blunt here for a moment. Your headquarters is less happy than your warehouses. So the people with the most power, influence, higher salaries are scoring much lower on engagement and satisfaction than the people who are in your warehouses. I've never seen that before. And then they like cracked. It was like, yes, our headquarters is a mess and these things are happening. I was like, all right, let's talk about that now. And they were spending all this time trying to justify their
Love
current
it.
state. But once I was like, this is the ultimate benchmark comparison. Like, this should not happen. Something is going on. And then they admitted, I was like, now I can help you. Because now we're talking about the thing that you were trying to bury under all this. Is this the right benchmark? How can we compare this? And so I find that a lot of times, as you said, when people start fighting you, it's because you're getting really close to the problem. And
Yeah.
so you need to like create a space where they can just engage with that problem more safely and be able to hear why your data is drawing that out.
I love that your example of the benchmarks because we get this all the time too, and people want really specific benchmarks. We want, as you said, like not just in the industry, this organization size, this kind of background, this specific location, and we have those kind of locations. We have locations in the U.S. and Canada, but we don't have them in Mexico. But we have UK. I'm like very quickly, there's nobody left, and so
Yeah.
benchmarks, I think, are interesting. Like external benchmarks can be an interesting measure, but really, what matters more is internal benchmarking. What you said,
Mhm.
right, is how does your headquarters compare to your front line? And usually, headquarters, like corporate kind of headquarters, always, generally speaking, in most industries, higher engagement than frontline. Or same thing with usually managers are more engaged than
Mhm.
employees, right? The higher you go in the organization, usually people are happy, and it makes sense, right? It makes sense because when you're like very senior, you have everybody's listening to you, you have a lot of power, and you have a lot of say and the work, and everybody is respecting you, and everybody is kind of catering to what you want to do. And if you're on the front line, you don't feel you have a say. But sometimes if this is inverted, and it takes, I think, our experience to know also how it usually is. For example, we always see in the engagement area, we always see this like U curve on how people go
Mhm.
through the engagement curve with an organization. So they join. Usually you get very excited, you're very happy, you're very engaged, you're highly like motivated to do great work. And then after a couple of years, you fall into this trough, basically saying, oh, well, now I understand how the honeymoon period is over, right? Now I understand how things really are, how now I'm working through all the politics. Now I maybe see some of the things that I don't have. And maybe now the grass looks green on the outside. And then after some time, you kind of see that actually all is not good, but also all is not bad. And you get a more realistic view, and you basically come up through that trough again. So knowing some of these things and sharing some of these things with with our clients, for example, is always helpful because they might see this internally benchmarking and say, well, is this normal or should we do something about it? A lot of times people, for example, ask, what should we do after 2 years? People are always kind of engagement drops and we lose some
Mhm.
people and all of that. And of course, you should think about what it is that bothers people and where you can help them. But it's also a natural curve, right? That it just goes with human nature. So understanding some of these things is really important too. And
Yeah,
that's
providing
no,
context.
yeah, providing context. The business context is such important thing, right? Because as we talked about before, for example, on engagement, um, in a high turnover organization, it's all about retention. In a low turnover organization, it's not about retention. It's actually about getting better business outcomes,
Right.
higher performance, right? Higher productivity, better team environments, all of those kind of things, rather than just retention.
Absolutely. So we're heading into the last 15 minutes. I want to remind everyone to use the Q&A if you have any questions for Kathi and I. Right now we have one question, but before we jump into that, Lane, I know we have a second poll we'd like people to fill out. Wonderful. So while all of you are clicking on that, let me read off the question so we all are on the same page. So we have a question from Stephanie saying, I'm a mid-level employee responsible for presenting people data and trends to our leaders on a quarterly basis. Based on what you shared today, I think I'm missing key context on business outcomes, pace of product releases, sales performance, to present the right stories to our leaders. Do you have advice on how I go about getting buy-in to get data from senior leaders about their teams?
Yeah, what a great question. And I'm so glad, Stephanie, that this is the message you got from what we talked about, because it's exactly what we're saying. Like, people data doesn't sit in isolation, and it's not just for people data's sake, but it's really in purpose of the business performance and of business data. I mean, you're not saying exactly how you sit, where you sit in the HR organization, but or if you sit in HR at all, but depending on how you're positioned, if you have direct access and direct relationships with senior leaders, I would just ask them basically, what do you care about? How can we help you? What would good look like? And share some examples of what other organizations, for example, have solved for. And maybe pace of product releases is one of the things that really matters to you. And you could say, for example, we know of a people team that saw that the products were not released as quickly. And so they worked on correlating the product release data with people data, with things like how long, for example, are the teams new? Are people getting onboarded quickly enough? Do they collaborate enough? All of those kind of people related things could impact pace of product release. And how can we help get data on that? Right. So having those direct conversation, if you're not directly working with business leaders, it could also be working with your HR business partners. In some organizations, they are more the interface to the business teams. So it kind of really depends on how you set up, but just finding somebody who has access to business teams and to the actual business, I think will really help. And just asking them, how can we help you? What would be things? What are problems that you're trying to solve? Not people problems, but business problems, because in the end of the day, every business problem is a people problem as well.
Yeah. You're looking for a way to say that business problem can be improved by pulling on these people levers. One other thing that you might want to think about is what is their personal resistance to sharing information if that's the issue. So for example, they may hide data about their teams because they don't want a senior leader to see that they have a problem and they get in trouble, and so they may not cooperate. So one of the things you can do is have this upgrade in your storytelling and your data be more incremental. Do it all together as let's talk about the relationship between the data that I'm presenting you and the business outcomes across all the teams. Get everybody kind of agreed to see that aggregated, anonymized data, find the relationship, and commit to making things better. And then go back to individuals and say, all right, we didn't share all of your individual information with the leaders, but we have it. And so we know you would benefit from these resources, which we're now going to be able to get you because you shared your data with us in the first place. And so really trying to make sure that they come out the winner of being honest and vulnerable is going to be essential to getting them to share data with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that I'm so glad you called this out, Ken, because I think the trust and the business relationships are really key. And ensuring people this is not basically something that will use your personal data or your specific team's performance on. This is really for aggregate kind of insights and action taking. I think really, really important, but it's challenging too. I mean, I've seen this as well in my own practitioner world. It's challenging for people to give up any of this business data. I mean, they don't want to necessarily give you like the patient satisfaction or patient safety data, for example, into your people data. So building those relationships, building that trust, and creating small wins, I think is really, really important. Even if you can show what you could do for the organization on a small scale, like a little test, a little thing basically where you could say, I helped this team to move something forward that the business cared about, right? They had an issue with maybe sales performance or whatever it is. And we found out that those like people related things were behind that. It really helps kind of create the case for it and do more of it.
Absolutely. We have another person asking if we have any resources that we can share as a template. I'm going to share my screen really quickly and we'll send you these slides afterwards. But one thing that I like to do is really think about the storytelling both before I'm doing a project and after as having these 6 elements. So what's the impact I'm trying to have on the business? What's the ROI that would bring to the business? What exactly am I doing? How do I know that doing it seems to be working? What does actually doing that activity immediately produce, and what are some of the costs? And then what is the primary cost of getting the whole thing started? And so that ends up looking like talking about the problem and estimated ROI to begin. So maybe we have a project we want to do. We say we think this project will result in these kinds of outcomes for us. So we do this project, it looks like that. And then we go back to what we said in the beginning and see if what we hypothesized actually ended up happening. So I find that that
Love
is
that.
a neat way to both conceptualize your project and the story you're going to tell about it when it's done.
Wow, I love that. It's so clear and so simple. So thanks, Ken, for sharing that.
Absolutely. Another question we have is how do you deal with tight deadlines or ad hoc requests where data is highly safeguarded and any data pull requires a ticket?
I think you just, I mean, you just have to set the right expectations when people ask you, basically, we need this tomorrow, or we need this today, or we need it yesterday. Sometimes these things, of course, come in. And people usually don't know what's realistic. So I think just being very open, being very transparent, and to say, we'll first also telling people, well, what other priorities are already in front of them, because oftentimes you get this, oh, it's an emergency, and everybody's emergency is not like everybody else's emergency. So also helping them understand how you prioritize, having a prioritization process as well will really help. And you can explain basically, okay, this is maybe sometimes people, for example, say, well, something that's compliance oriented and really deadline oriented, where we could get into kind of legal or compliance issues, it's a higher priority than something that's more strategic and forward. Well, looking, it doesn't mean that it's more important. The other one might be more important, but the first one might need to get basically prioritized just because of that impact. So explain to people both the prioritization process that you have and the criteria that you have for prioritizing, and what it could take to basically get to this data is really, really important. And oftentimes people just have no idea, right? They think, oh, how hard could it be, right? You just click a button. And sometimes it's not, you just click a button. You need to, as you said, get into different systems, different priorities and all of that. So just being transparent and explaining prioritization as well as data creation or analytics process, I think really important.
Yeah, I think it's so essential. I would also add, consider turning that person into your ally to go talk to the third person in this chain. So someone is saying these are the rules by which
Yeah.
this has to happen. If that's not you, rather than letting yourself become seen as the blocker who's not letting your stakeholder get what they want, go back to them and be like, hey, there's a whole bunch of rules. They exist for various reasons. I would be very happy to work with you to talk to person number three and come up with a unique process for your stuff that satisfies the requirements and that allows me to help you in a much more effective way. That way they see you not as you don't eat the blocker politic. You actually are an enabler to the extent that you can, and the person who actually owns the question of what is the safest way to do this gets pulled into a constructive conversation. It's not just a bunch of butting heads.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good point.
We also have a question in the chat of how do we get leadership on board with the HRIS payroll change we did since they hate the user interface, reporting, etc. I would say buy HiBob, but like that's a whole
Well,
other
that's good.
conversation. Kathy, what are some of your thoughts there?
Well, I think, I mean, the change has already been made, presumably, as I understand it from the question. And the UI and reporting is usually what it is. And yeah, it might not be the most intuitive. That's what you get from a lot of systems, not HiBob, because that's built around the UI. But I know lots of systems are just not built for uh, managers or leaders. They're more built for HR to basically kind of use. So I think I'd go back to why you made that change, how it helps you get probably better data, more reliable data, more consistent insights, not just the UI, right? Because presumably, anytime you change an HRS or a payroll to uh, it's not just about the UI. Usually UI is kind of the last consideration. So I'd go back to why you made that change, what value you create from it already, and basically sell it like that, or remind leadership on that. Presumably they bought off on it and they bought it, right? So I think I'd go back to that and yeah, just be very clear on what the business case was for bringing this in.
I think some of the other things you can think about is do they actually hate these things or is something else happening? It's a little bit like in relationships when someone's yelling at you about like putting the toothbrush in the wrong place. You're like, this isn't really about the toothbrush. This is about the thing that we had a fight about yesterday that's coming back about the
I love
toothbrush.
that.
So if they're fighting over what seem like really small, like I just don't like the interface, I just don't like the way the report looks, are they uncomfortable with the reporting? Do they need some coaching on how to find what they want? Are they super busy and just getting frustrated and demanding that it be easier because no one's given them training because they're a senior person? So why do senior people need to be trained? I find that respect for what's above you tends to make it much harder for them to get help. So I would also sort of poke around a little bit and see if it might just be that they find it hard, and if you can make it easier for them, they might flip around really quickly.
Yeah, I think that asking why 7 times might work here too, right? So why do you hate it? Why is it, what is it you're trying to accomplish? What's behind, like the question behind the question or the concern behind the concern might help here too. So I really like that.
Absolutely. So that takes us through the questions we have now. But Kathy, is there any last thoughts or messages you want to share with our audience before we close for today?
Well, this was really fun, and I really enjoyed the question, and also enjoyed talking with you, Ken. It's a topic that's so important. I think, and I'm so encouraged that so many people joined us and are interested in learning this. I think just the the fact that you joined this webinar, that you're interested in doing this, if you're in HR, shows that you're actually building the skills that you'll need more of tomorrow. because I was just working with a HR team, a CHRO team of one of our clients yesterday, and we talked about what HR business partners, for example, have to do, and we talked about storytelling with data as one of the key capabilities. And somebody said, well, not exactly why you go into HR because you're good with data. Usually, this is not something that most people are comfortable with or good with. So I think don't be discouraged if you don't get it right kind of initially. It's a muscle and it's a skill set that you have to build up on. But then also trust your instincts to basically ask the right questions and just get people get the relationships with the business together, and it will take you much further than trying to solve this all on your own.
Teamwork. That's the whole point, reason why we create an organization. It's the thing that's going to get us through all the other challenges that we face as an organization. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much for your time, Kathi, and your really great insights on how to be more persuasive with our executives and leaders.
Thank you so much for having me, Ken. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Have a great day, and everyone, enjoy your days as well. Thank you, and good day.